Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Slaveryarchive Book Club. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am hosting this session along with my co-hosts, Jessica Johnson and Vanessa Holden, who is also presenting her book today. Then we are here, four co-hosts, myself, Vanessa Holden, she is at University of Kentucky, Jessica Johnson at Hopkins, and Alex Hill, who is not here yet, but is going to be here soon, and he is at Columbia. Then I want to welcome you all to this session. You are going to discuss today the new book by Vanessa Holden. This book is titled Surviving Southampton, African-American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community. And this is a book that was just published by University of Illinois Press. Let me introduce Vanessa. After, we are going to have a short presentation, and those of you who want to ask questions after the presentation, you can just raise your hand if you are on Zoom, or if you are on YouTube, you can put your questions in the chat. Feel free also, of course, to use the chat here on Zoom. Of course, that those who are on YouTube will not be able to see, but you'll be glad to know from where you are coming from and to say hello. Then let me introduce Vanessa. Vanessa Holden, she is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Holden, she received her PhD in African American and women's and gender history from Rutgers University. She currently has a dual appointment in both the Department of History and also in the program of African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. Her research focuses on African American women and slavery in the antebellum South, and her areas of interest are the history then of resistance and rebellion, gender history, and the history of sex, sexuality. She offers then courses in American history, African American history, and African American studies. The book that you are going to discuss today explores the contributions that African American women and children made to the Southampton Rebellion, often called Nat Turner's Rebellion. And her writing has been published in the Slavery and Abolition, a journal of slave and post-slave studies, Black Perspectives, Perspectives on History, Process, a blog for American history, and the Rumpus. Also, Vanessa, she is the co-host of this book club, and we are live for 1 year now since COVID started. Then welcome, Vanessa, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, co-conveners, for this opportunity to talk about my work that just came out. And so I know out there, folks, some of you have a hold of the copy of the book, some of you have them on order. And so what I want to do is give folks an idea of some of what I touch on in the book. And I want to talk about geography and the uses of geography in the book to give us sort of a springboard for questions. Of course, I'm happy to answer your questions about other parts of the book as they come up. But first, I'm going to hope that the Zoom gods are with me and share my screen briefly. So everybody bear with me. And something that authors in the fiction world do that I really like is that they often read from their work. And so I want to read a passage from the beginning of my second chapter, Enslaved Women and Strategies of Evasion and Resistance. Charlotte and Esther. The heat of a Southside August was kind to cotton and nothing else. The only other living things that looked forward to the heat were preachers. It was sitting in season for the white folk who could travel to revivals. They would wait on the Lord and wait for the king, King Cotton, to burst open, make his presence known, and demand more tribute in sweat and scars. The white, fluffy wealth was all over the county. Some big men had vast fields, while many others had patches here and there. In the heat and the foggy haze of swampy humidity, the cotton no longer needed chopping. It just needed sun and water and time. Then the hardest season would come in a wave of bursting bowls. The cotton would open up, and the hands would sweep it up, and the gins would clean it up, and the hands would moat it out and cart it. But in August, the cotton would bide time and mature, and the hands would spend less time in the fields and more time occupied elsewhere. For women like Charlotte, there was never an end to work, no matter what season it was. The cotton was just one thing growing. In the summer of 1831, for example, her new enslaver, Lavinia Frances, was close to welcoming her first child. Lavinia was only 18 at the time. Her young husband, Nathaniel Frances, brought his wife to his childhood home place from Northampton County, North Carolina, just over the border from Southampton County, Virginia. Lavinia took over as manager of the farm's domestic labor and laborers from Nathaniel's mother, who still lived on the place. With the new woman of the house came another new woman, Esther, an enslaved woman, came along from North Carolina as a wedding gift, like a trunk or a trousseau. The heat could not have been easy on Lavinia in her condition. She'd grown up in the heat of the region just across the border, but that summer she was sweating for two. Perhaps the Frances family later recalled rebels arriving on their place in the morning of August 22nd, 1831, on the heels of a young boy they knew from the farm of neighboring kin, but the truth was that rebels had arrived much earlier than that. Frances's enslaved laborers, Sam and Will, were both original conspirators with Nat Turner, who, along with a small group of others, had plotted at least since that spring to foment rebellion in the neighborhood. Will had been in the Frances' holdings since the time of Nathaniel's father, Samuel Frances. The enslaved man Sam had arrived on the farm in the early 1820s. As one historian of the rebellion points out, the holdings of Nathaniel and his sister together would produce 4 of the 7 original insurgents, including the leader, his chief lieutenant, and the executioner. Ultimately, 6 men and boys from Nathaniel Frances's place, none of whom were recent arrivals to his holdings, traveled the county with the rebels in August 1831. The happenings around and outside the Frances home place have received ample attention from historians. When the rebels arrived on the farm, they murdered the Frances' overseer and 2 white boys. They searched for Lavinia, Nathaniel, and Nathaniel's mother. When they could not find them, they went on to a neighboring farm. The rebellion at the Frances farm did not end when the men and boys left. Charlotte and Esther, who remained behind, set to work preparing food for the men to return to and began fighting over Lavinia's belongings. They assumed the rebels had murdered her. Lavinia Frances was not dead. She'd passed out from the heat in an attic cubbyhole where a person enslaved by the extended Frances family had hidden her. When she woke up, she made her way to the kitchen behind the house, where she could hear Charlotte and Esther fighting. The 3 women regarded each other, and at the following moments moved quickly. Charlotte grabbed a handy knife and lunged at Lavinia. Esther stepped between them and held off Charlotte, who just missed dispatching their enslaver. Lavinia grabbed a nearby wheel of cheese and fled to the woods. In the space of a few hours, Lavinia Frances had escaped death twice, once at the hand of enslaved men and once at the other end of an enslaved woman's kitchen knife. Esther and Charlotte's participation in the Southampton Rebellion was distinctly different from that of their male counterparts, who were elsewhere in the county by the time Lavinia Frances came to. Their rebellion happened within the context of the Frances farm's specific geographies. The farm's kitchen was a site of significant domestic labor and a space where the Franceses may have housed enslaved people. It was both intimate space and a thoroughfare. Within individual households, on individual farms, whites reproduced and curated the same geographies of surveillance and control that broader Virginia society maintained. Law and custom dictated that enslavers were the architects of control in intimate spaces, sites of domestic labor, spaces where enslaved people processed each other's yield, and the fields. Enslaved women's gendered labor forced them to navigate each type of space on small and medium-sized farms. The Frances kitchen was one such space, and Charlotte and Esther's confrontation with Lavinia Frances is one example of 2 geographies intersecting. So I talk about geography in the sense that I talk about what Southampton County is like and its physical geography, that it's dotted with swamps, that it's full of sandy soil that's really good for growing cotton, which is pretty distinct in Virginia. There aren't many other places in Virginia where you can grow cotton. Um, and I also talk about geography in the sense of the geography of individual home places. That enslaved women like Charlotte and Esther very much would have been expected to help out with heavy agricultural tasks. At the same time, on a holding as small as the Francises, they would have been expected to also do domestic work. It also isn't really lost on me that there's also some intimate geography that this incident traverses, that Esther very well could have sat on the very trunk that she and Charlotte were fighting over on her journey from Carolina to Virginia, regarded just like the belongings in that trunk. The other kind of geography that comes into play in the work that I do in the book is maybe some methodological geography. And since there are many historians on the in the chat tonight, I thought I would give a little tour of some of the ways that I work with the archive for this book. I look at a lot of the sources that people have looked at for a very long time when it comes to the Southampton Rebellion. And one of the most fruitful sources are the court records, the court minute books produced in the wake of the rebellion. A number of enslaved people were put on trial for their participation. These trials were mostly about making sure enslavers got compensated if they had an enslaved person who was suspected of being part of the rebellion. If the militia were to murder them, they wouldn't get any compensation, but if an official court and the Commonwealth decided to execute some of their enslaved property, then the Commonwealth of Virginia would compensate them. Not really with their market value on the open market, but they would receive compensation. These minute books are really big. They're table-sized books. And this is what they look like. And they, depending on which clerk you run into different types of difficulty reading them. But to just give you a quick illustration, so here is where a court date begins. In October of 1831. You actually have to turn the minute book page. So it's really roughly a page to 2 pages of happenings on that court date before you get to an enslaved person's trial. So if you just zoom in only to transcripts of the trials or only to parts where people suspected of rebellion are being tried, you're really missing everybody else and all of the other court business that's happening on a particular date. So for example, on this particular date, if you skipped over that, you would miss this list of free people of color who'd showed up at court that day to register. It was a requirement in Virginia. There was a call for free people in the county to come in and register. So really, honestly, it was sort of literally juxtaposed as people who want their freedom read into the record right next to someone who is facing capital punishment for potentially being involved in the rebellion. So that's another kind of geography that I work with. There are many types, but the final type I want to talk about is the geography of memory and historical memory. So Southampton County is still a place, and there are still people living there, many of whom are descendants of people who I talk about. I often actually begin by noting that I'm talking about the geography of indigenous land. I'm talking about places that indigenous people inhabited first and strategized, resisting the English, resisting Americans first, and many of their techniques we really need to acknowledge. And I also want to acknowledge that both the Nottoway and Chernahaka Nottoway are still present, and they though they go by different names, of course their preferences should be respected, that they very much are a modern groups of people who are still living in the area. There are also African American descendants of enslaved people in the county who still own land there. And there are white descendants of the enslavers in my book. For example, one of Lavinia Francis's descendants is now the court clerk in the county and has actually done a lot of work to bring these documents to more people, is responsible for making sure Nat Turner's Bible actually made it to the museum, the African American Museum in DC. I also think it's really important to acknowledge vernacular curation, that people in Southampton County worked out their own ways to remember what they refer to as the rebellion, like it just happened. So while it is a modern place with modern people who have modern lives, it's also important to note that there are a number of commemoration efforts that are very much a part of the landscape. And so here's an image that I took in 2019, the last time I was in the county. Some of Nat Turner's descendants actually own the land where he was once enslaved. That happened in the early 20th century. And recently, in the 21st century, one of his descendants actually posted his own sign very near to Cabin Pond, where the rebellion began. And I think it's also really important to think about how his own descendants want him remembered. Nathaniel Nat Turner, a literate minister, slave, and leader of the Southampton slave insurrection of August 21st, 1831, hid in caves near the site until his capture on October 30th, 1831. And one of the things that is really touching to me about this particular sign, aside from its location and the fact that it's actually his descendant who produced it, is that what it highlights are Turner's leadership of a slave rebellion, but also that he hid in caves and evaded capture for a number of months after the rebellion itself. The sign itself was actually shot through, and you can actually see where the county replaced it with another overlapping sign. But that hidden caves is very important because his descendants actually came forward and noted that they had been curating for a number of generations at this point the cave that they believe Nat Turner hid out in. And some of the questions that actually led me to this book were questions about that time that Nat Turner spent in hiding. He could not have fed himself. And so one of the early questions I had about this rebellion was who fed Nat Turner? How did he survive? And that led me to women like Charlotte and Esther. It led me to broader community resistance. Additionally, and worth noting, are very, very recent. So in February of this year, Blackhead Signpost, a road named for the site in Southampton County, it's marked here in red, where enslaved people's heads were placed on pikes as a warning to other enslaved people. There was a road that's now being outlined in red named after that site. And so Blackhead Signpost was on the green street sign. This February, through a number actually of community efforts, a long-standing petition, and actually I would say, let's make this go back. They actually took down the signs. They've actually renamed the road to Signpost Road. So preserving the history of the road while listening to African Americans in particular in the community who recognize the violence of calling it Blackhead Signpost. So I'm really traversing a few different types of geography in the book to get at where we find women, where we find children, where we find free people of color in this rebellion that everybody thinks they know about. The book isn't really about Nat Turner, and it isn't about diminishing him either. He himself actually begins his own narration of the events of 1831 by talking about his family. He actually talks about his childhood. He talks about being raised by his mother and father, being raised by his grandmother, and the importance of being given and imbued with a sense of what Dinah Remy Berry would call soul value. So if that's where he begins, why shouldn't we begin there and look at, what community actually produced a slave rebellion that resulted in the murder of almost 60 white men, women, and children, the arrest and capture of around 50 free and enslaved African Americans, the of um, execution of African Americans, and also the sort of extra legal violence against African Americans. And if you sort of only focus on the fact that one woman was hung through official court proceedings, then you miss all the other ways that women are integral to this story. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has about the book. Happy to talk about any of the groups of people I just mentioned. Happy to talk about my time in Southampton County.
Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation, Vanessa. Let's see if we have any questions now. I am not seeing any hands at this point, but I give you a few seconds to be the first. Who does want to start? Okay, we have two hands. Let's start with Tatiana. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Vanessa. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I love the cover. It's a very superficial question. It looks like you almost asked an artist, or maybe you did it. And I wondered if that was, whether that was important. It probably was, since it's so curated. But I wondered if you could just talk to us about that process.
Yeah, sure. The cover actually has a really wonderful, delightful story. It's a very like chicken soup for the historian's soul in some ways. I was in Baltimore doing an event with Tara Hunter and a number of other people, and we had some downtime at the event, and we went to the Baltimore Museum of Art, and we saw these really amazing story quilts. And I have one, so I'll share a picture.
Yeah, sure.
Let's see if it'll do it. There we go. So we saw a whole series that this artist did of story quilts about the rebellion. And this quilt, Special Child, really struck me because it's of a female figure with a young, presumably male figure on her lap reading. And Stephen Towns is the artist. And the whole series is about the rebellion, but it really focuses in a number of ways. Each quilt focuses on the community. So later that evening, I got to do the event, and there was a man on the front row who was taking a lot of notes. And he came up afterwards and said hi and said, "Oh, I've done a little bit of work about rebellion." And I said, oh my God, you're Stephen Towns. You're the person whose art I just saw. I can't believe it. Could I use your quilt on my book cover? And he said, sure, just get in touch with me when the time comes. So the press mocked up a cover with the quilt, and unfortunately it doesn't read very well in 2 dimensions. You can't see all the beautiful detail. You can't see the ways that he was working with fabric and texture. So instead, the cover artist looked for another series that he did called the Black Magic series of paintings. And so this image that's on the cover is in that series that is about Nat Turner and his wife, Cherry Turner. And the title of the painting is "The Righteous and the Wise, and Their Works Are in the Hands of God." It's acrylic on canvas. So he plays a lot with religious iconography, and this motif of butterflies is in a lot of his work. It's in the quilts. It's in this series. And of course, religious art icons, whenever they're holding something, it's really significant. So I fell in love with this work. Um, so no, I did not do it. That would be real. If I could paint like that, I would not begin this history game.
That's
But I love,
beautiful.
you get the community representation behind her. You get broken shackles. You get her holding a baby, which is very important to the kind of community I'm talking about. But if you get a chance, check out Stephen's
Yeah.
website. If I get a breath, I'll add it to the chat.
Oh yeah.
And the Black Magic series is the series that the painting comes from. He's at Falling Water right now. He's an artist in residence there, and he's working on a portrait of the Black woman who cooked for the white family that owned Falling Water, and is doing some really interesting work with portraits at this right now. But his work on the Southampton Rebellion is maybe the first time I've seen what I kind of felt and knew visiting the county, like represented in that way. It moves beyond what I could do as a historian, and so I was so happy he was so gracious to let me use it.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. And Vanessa, now we have Roseanne. She has a question. Then let's go. Nice to see you.
Vanessa, congratulations. And for everybody else I taught for 25 years, the best class I ever had was the one where Vanessa came to talk about work. Those are facts. I had a question both about Southampton and some of the things you brought up about geography and memory, and what you said about not wishing the book to quote unquote diminish Nat Turner. Because actually, I looked back last week completely by accident at the publicity we did for the public event, not what you did in my class, and referring to these forgotten women. And the two-part question is this: when you say that in the county, it's remembered by whom? And, because, for example, one of the things that I know from my own local geography in Greater New Orleans is that there's a body of people that remember the 1811 slave rebellion, and then there's a whole vast body of people for whom it's just not a thing. And Nat Turner's rebellion was much more part of the national consciousness and had a much bigger profile. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how that memory is distributed, and both sort of within the county and sort of in what sort of closer metropolitan. And the other, which is the bigger question, the one I really want to ask, is how you think about this question of how rebellion is remembered. And, most of the people credited with being quote unquote leaders of armed rebellion have these large personalities and all this charisma, but I've always been very cautious about that as a narrative, because there's no incentive, unlike leading a war today, there's no incentive to saying, hey, I'm the guy. But there's a lot of incentive on the part of the people doing the prosecuting and dominating the memory for the pre-freedom years in putting it on one character, And so exactly, you said the project of this book is not diminishing Turner, but I kind of, I've been thinking a lot about how you complicate who leads, what leads it is.
So it certainly decenters him in a number of ways, and actually decenters him like at his behest. I think his jailhouse confessions, mediated as that source is, fraught as that source is. For those of you who don't know, Nat Turner was interviewed while he was held in the local jail by a local lawyer who eventually sold what he transcribed as the Confessions of Nat Turner. He sold it as a pamphlet to make money. So obviously, as a source, it's incredibly fraught. It's very mediated. But there are details and pieces of it, I think, as I read it, knowing what I know about slavery and enslaved people, where it's not the sort of detail that I think a white lawyer looking to make money is going to fabricate. It's a little too, I don't think that's where he's going to put in effort to fabricate things or cut corners. And one of those places is where Turner's family comes into play. An interesting thing that I learned along the road writing this book is that Nat Turner's Rebellion was really not called Nat Turner's Rebellion until the 20th century. that even in the early 20th century, a lot of the books, especially books written by people from Virginia and Southside Virginia, they called it the Southampton Rebellion, they called it the Southampton Insurrection, they called it the Trouble in Southampton, they called it the Massacre in Virginia. And you'll note on that sign put up by a descendant of Nat Turner, it's called the Southampton Insurrection, that it's the place that this rebellion took, right, or where the rebellion took place, right, that is important to people in their memory. In my experience in the county, folks black and white refer to it as the rebellion, because of course there's only one you could be talking about. And it's incredibly present. It is in the street signs. Blackhead Signpost was one street sign, but there's a Cabin Pond Road, there's a Porterhouse Road. So I think it's important to note, right, that place and rootedness in place and geography is really significant and important here. So I think that rather maybe diminish is not really the right word. I think I've gotten some questions in past presentations, is this just disrespectful to Nat Turner? Are you trying to knock down a really important folk hero? And my answer is no, actually. I'm actually taking his lead. I'm taking the lead of his descendants in some ways. And I'm really trying to think through, if you really decenter him, who do you see? And the beauty of that is really trusting the silence that's there. Nat Turner, in his confessions, doesn't name a single person who hasn't already been either killed, convicted, or convicted, right? So he's not giving up names of folks who are not already where they're going to be post-rebellion. And I think it's important to reiterate as many times as I can that silence saves lives. And I think that, yeah, of course officials were looking for somebody to be very clear about pinning this on. And of course he occupies an important place in this history. But what work is being done in these court testimonies? What work is being done in keeping silent? And how many women are testifying in court who are at significant murders and they're not on trial, right? How is it that they're not on trial? And some of that has to do with what white people in power are willing to concede. What would the psychic cost be of admitting everybody was in on it? And some of it is that their strategies work. These women were not wrong and their strategies worked. And that's how their children, lived to end up owning the land that they were once enslaved on.
Yeah, thank you. We could talk forever, but we will. Hours.
Thank you. Thank you, Roseanne. And Vanessa, we have another question from Cynthia Gayton. Then Cynthia, I am highlighting you. Please go ahead.
I'm really interested in this subject, and I really like the idea of place. I'm fascinated with maps, and I like seeing the relationships between the people and the place. So I really, you've added some words to my vocabulary about how to think of geography. So I really appreciate that. I work on history in Harpers Ferry, and Nat Turner, of course, was very influential in over John Brown. And some of the people that I am researching in Harpers Ferry, I was looking into some cemeteries there, one that had been established for the town and another African-American cemetery, and looking at the relationships. So there were people up there they were free and had never been recorded in any way, in any document, because even though it was law that any free person had to be recorded, had never been enforced until Nat Turner. And so there were a lot of people who were upset up in having basically being outed in that way. And I also was looking at the Nat Turner insurrection or rebellion, noticing the family relationships, and that was something I was interested in too. So as you look through that, so my question is dealing with these family relationships, because that's something very interesting. I'm looking at a woman in particular, and she's silent through my whole research. I don't have her saying anything, but she was present in many places. So I was interested in how are you using the descendants' voices as expressing the women who were not speaking because they did not testify, they, because they were not on trial. But I'm wondering how, and I'll get the book because now I'm really interested. But how did you fill in those spaces with silence? Because I was actually at one point thinking there should be a movie where you're looking at the dialogue of the slave owners, and then you have the slaves just talking, but there's no sound coming out because the words are not being written down and there's nobody recording them. So in any event, I was wondering how you handled that as a historian, because there's so much absence. I'm having to, I don't want to be false in a depiction of what might have been said because of everything else going on around. There's circumstantial evidence, right? But there's no actual evidence. So I'm interested in how you handle that as a researcher and an author.
So one piece of this, right, is thinking about Black women on small to mid-sized farms and plantations more broadly. So some of the work that I do dives into the labor economy in Southampton County and the ways that women were expected to be really versatile laborers on these small to mid-sized farms, so that they may be working in the orchard one day and then in the field another day. They certainly were eligible for field labor, but also they had to do a lot of child rearing for both Black and white children. And what I demonstrate in my chapter about women is that there was a work-related reason for both enslaved and free women to be basically anywhere on a given farm or plantation during the workday. That would not have been true for enslaved men in the region. There's really only one place they're going to be during the day, and that should be in the fields. So this gave women access to information and intelligence that was incredibly useful during the rebellion. I have a few examples of where women are passing on critical information during the rebellion. And I get those references from the places where they show up in the court record. So enslaved women and one free woman are asked to give depositions. At the time, it wasn't a Law and Order situation where they're standing, in front and testifying. They record these depositions, and then a lawyer reads them into the record, either for the defense or the prosecution. But they basically, in these depositions, they let me know where they were as the rebellion was happening, and then I can triangulate what I know happened on a given farm or plantation. So for example, I talk about a woman named Venus who lived on the Porter plantation. And she is testifying in a case where she talks about basically informing a couple of enslaved men that the insurgents had already come and gone. Now, if you read Turner's confessions, he talks about when he showed up at Porter Place, and without mentioning any names, he says, I understood there. That's the sort of passive phrasing he uses. I understood there that the alarm had gone out, right? So I'm able to suggest that if Venus, in another trial is talking about passing on critical information about the comings and goings, it stands to reason that when Nat Turner showed up a few hours earlier, he understood at the Porter Place what is critical intelligence, that they lost the element of surprise. From Venus, a Black woman who lives there. The other way that I get at women's voices is through their experiences as parents to children, and through children's memories of parents in the WPA narratives. Nobody who was interviewed in the 1930s would have been alive in 1831. But many of the narratives that come out of Southampton County are remembering enslaved childhoods after the rebellion, so the survival piece. So what you're really hearing when they talk about living in Southampton County are their memories of their childhood post-rebellion, the memories of older siblings and kin who had lived through the rebellion, and you're actually hearing the echoes of kind of the warnings that their elders gave them. So one of the people I quote, he talks about Charlotte and Esther. He talks about his grandmother. But he also, in his interview, can still recite, and this man would have been in his 90s in the 1930s, he can still recite times and days of the week for the very specific slave patrol program in Southampton County during his childhood in the 1850s. So that tells you something about, right, like what really important key information are parents teaching children, are adults teaching children. And then sometimes, sort of like in music, where the rests are as important as where there are notes, the fact that Turner never mentions Venus, the fact that Venus answers a very narrow set of questions, and that's it. She would not have had much choice about answering them, but she would have had choice in how she finessed those answers. So it's true, bleeding stones here to kind of get at where these women are, because they were really good at hiding. So, right. So there's like some of the evidence I have is that I'm never going to get, that diary that's, hiding in an attic in Southampton County somewhere. And for good reason, because silence saves lives.
Thank you so much. We have now, let me just see if I am following the order. Martha Schoolman, let's see. You can unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Okay, I think I'm turned back on. Thank you for this presentation. I'm really excited to get a hold of your book. Congratulations. I'm also very interested in geography questions from a literary point of view, but one of the things I was thinking during your presentation was how you were engaging questions of natural history and environmental history, and how that kind of contributed to this sort of sense of presence that you still have in Southampton. I love the way you described the kind of cycles of the cotton crop and the fact that those caves are still these caves, So I was just wondering how you kind of put those things together in your book, because that's just a kind of set of associations that seem to kind of beyond geography particularly, that seem to be kind of forming.
I want to pull up the map that I showed everyone previously real quick, because maps are
I love a map. Yeah.
Always good for what they're good for, though. They can't always tell us everything we need to know. But I worked with a map maker you'll just have to ignore my little animation as it plays out. But I worked with a map maker to look at a few different historical maps. Some of the roads that are there in the county now were roads then. But something that I've seen left out of previous maps of the rebellion route are where all the swamps are. So the rebellion route makes sense when you figure out where the farms were. The rebellion route makes some more sense when you figure out what roads they may have been trying to avoid or roads that they're running parallel to. But they also make sense. It also makes a lot more sense when you look at where the swamp is, where they're avoiding swamps that they would have known well and swamps that they would have cut through all the time. I've been to Cabin Pond. It's still there. It's a marshy swamp. And I think that, it's important to think about the role that more frequent forms of resistance played in this rebellion. It begins with a barbecue. It begins with stolen brandy, and it begins in a swamp. And he ends up, his cave, as you can see on the map, it's very near the pond where they initially launched a rebellion. I thought a lot about the environment and environmental history because Southampton County happens to be this place where this soil band that wraps up through Georgia just barely touches Virginia. It's like the only soil in Virginia that's good for upland short staple cotton. And that created a lying in time that wouldn't have existed for for other crops. How is that shaping what sorts of things women are doing? So one thing, that goes with the cotton is that women were expected to do a lot of the processing work that came with cotton, from ginning to carding it to spinning it. There are weaving cottages and spinning houses all over the county. Free women of color are often circulating through these after harvest season. So looking at the environment actually led me to ways that women were much more mobile than we often think of enslaved women being. We think in Virginia, we think of like enslaved watermen who were really mobile, or enslaved artisans who had a particular kind of class mobility. But really looking at this community and seeing the ways that the environment actually ultimately ends up contributing to women's mobility in the community, it opened up a whole new, what does that mean that these women are showing up to weave in weaving cottages and leaving? What does it mean that in a lot of these small farms, they had a cotton patch, and that actually ended up becoming the clothes people were wearing. It wasn't actually part of this, much larger cotton economy in that way. The environment actually helped me open up places where there was a lot of silence, and helped me get at things in people's lived experiences that I wouldn't have got at if I didn't spend time with like sand on my shoes, and thinking about, well, how long would it really take you to get from this place to this place if you didn't use the road? At what age would you have learned that that's how you get from that place to that place? And something that another historian's work was really helpful for with my own work, David F. Almendinger's work. He looks at all of the white families in this neighborhood, and they really were using slave holdings to bolster their economic prospects, but they were also moving people around within their families to preserve generational wealth in ways that we don't necessarily think about. It's not that people were inheriting people when someone died in an estate. They were actually moving people as young children to their families' estates. Sally Travis and Nathaniel Francis were brother and sister. The people on their places had moved in between their holdings a few times, some of them. So there's this other connectedness that comes with like maybe a different kind of ecology, the kind of human ecology of this community that you wouldn't quite get at if you only looked at the map.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Marta. And now you have Jessica.
Which one?
Jessica Marie Johnson. I am trying to make her, to spotlight her, but I can't.
This is like the millennial pitfall. Like, which of the 40 Jessicas are we talking to today?
Spotlight yourself, Jessica.
Is it my co-friend Spirit? Is that who's on the chat?
Okay, she's there.
You get me?
Yeah.
On Spotlight. Okay. Hi, everybody. You're gonna hear my child screaming. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
First of all, congratulations on a phenomenal text that is so long in coming. I'm so excited. I feel like I've been waiting for this for my whole life. I am just really incredibly thrilled and very happy for you. And I just want to celebrate you and just like really just be excited about this achievement. And it really is an achievement. There is so much, I have so many questions. There's so much here to talk about, but I actually wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about some of the ways that you situate your text, your praxis, particularly thinking about the silences, your writing, your use of narrative, and your commitment to community. I was wondering if you what legacy, like where do you get that from, basically? Like, what are you in a legacy of particular scholars? Are there methods that you've especially, been determined to employ that you want to discuss even further than like Black geographies comes to mind? But yeah, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about where you come from, essentially. Thanks.
So you have a pretty non-scholarly answer to that. So I've dedicated this work to two of my great grandmothers. And one of them who I knew, and one of them who I didn't ever get to know. And I know kind of, so in my family, the generational wealth that I got from my people were the stories of survival. That, you know, that their story, their survival, that was it. That was what they gave me. So, you know, they didn't give me, you know, down payments on houses, or I don't know, the family oil well or whatever. No, that's not what I got. And my abuelita, my mother's grandmother, had 15 children who lived to adulthood. She had a few sets of twins who did not. And she was a bruja, but she was also she was a midwife. And she saved my grandmother's life when she was an infant and had pneumonia, by cooking up the right poultice. And my grandmother had scars on her chest when I knew her, from the kind of way that she knew how to give her child breath, right? So I know the stories, and the power of those narratives. And I also know through the power of those narratives, my Gram's narrative of Depression era migration from Texas to Southern California. I know from these stories of survival of women in my own lineage that when people in the profession or the archive say our history cannot be known, that's not true, because we know it. We know it. We know our history. And I'm sure there's some baptismal record somewhere that, you know, records my great-grandmother's birth. And I know there is documentation of when her children brought her across the border. And I know, you know, about that there's part of her life that's documented in East LA where she eventually ended her days. But what I also know, right, is the kind of survivor's legacy that I was handed. And so there's a way in which when I entered this archive and people were saying, oh, you're not going to find women, you're never going to find them. Like, I know that the evidence of these women's histories are in their descendants, and they're in their descendants who now own the land that Turner was enslaved on. They're in the descendants who own land and are absentee landlords. Like, they rent out the land and they're not there, right? That there's a rootedness there, that is evidence in and of itself, right? That there are people who continue to live there, tells me, right, that there's this story here. So that's a very like non-academic answer. I also know the power of narrative because in a former life, I was a creative writing major. And so that comes to bear in the way that I think about languaging, who I find. You probably noticed that in the excerpts that I read, and I wanted to read it because I know people don't necessarily have the book yet, but I wanted a book that, you know, yes, there are historical arguments there and there's citations and all these things, right? But unless you really think about, unless you've stood in Southampton County when the cotton is up, like there's this overwhelmingness to that particular crop that if you've never really seen cotton, I know many people on the chat tonight have, but if you've never really seen it, right, I want to put you there, right? White people are gone because they're at the revival. The Travises most likely were at a revival the night before this jumped off, right? Like, unless you're thinking about what it means to sip brandy from one of these stills that you, an enslaved master distiller, know about, right? I want to put people in the place as much as I can, because to some extent that sandy loam, like, that's what people have, and the fact that descendants are holding on to it tells me that I got to get people to feel what that is to really get into the place. So there's that answer. And then of course there are all of the amazing scholars of Black women's history who are all over my citations. You know, shout out to Deborah Gray White, who showed me a lot of possibility. Shout out to Stephanie Camp, speaking her name into the space. Shout out to Shawande Mustaqim. Shout out to Stephanie Smallwood, both scholars who deal with violence in the language of violence in ways that I endeavored to. I learned so much from Stephanie Smallwood when it came to narrating court records, right? Making these really dry records alive. What does it mean that you're walking from a jail into a courthouse and you can see the gallows? Like, how do I get a map that demonstrates you can see the gallows and you can see the open grave where they're just throwing our bodies, right? In a region where everybody's got a family plot that some aunt takes diligent care of. Like, you take care of the dead in that county. So what does that mean? That Pottersfield, it's actually still there. Pottersfield is still there. The county owns it and nobody will build anything on it. Or really step on it. There's like a whole, there's also a lot of ghosts in this county. There are a lot of restorations that have been halted because of just blood that periodically shows up on walls, things like this. So that's the other place, I would go. But I think I want to, for this, so I just root it in that lived experience. That's how I came to this. The scholarship, I do adequately cite lots of folks, but I also have this kind of citation of women who never had access to what I have access to. And they taught me the power of really good stories. And they taught me the power of a cogent warning, right? When to be careful and when to just shut up, because that was also a real good skill to learn for survival.
Thank you, Vanessa. And we have now another question from Mary Elliott.
Hi, Dr. Holden. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I regret that I came on a little late, but I got to hear some of your reading from the book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. My question is twofold, and it focuses on your archival research. One is looking at the past and one is looking at the present. So looking at the past, I know you had a narrow focus when you went to the archives, it sounds like, but I really appreciate that you talked about the other cases that were also on the books at the time. And I'm wondering if you took the time to read into any of those a little bit further beyond just people registering, to get, we talk about these silences, but to get a perspective of what's going on in the environment, very nuanced and specific to that space and that time. And then the other question is, in our current social political climate, you brought this up, but you didn't expound on it. And I've worked in Mississippi in the archives, and I've experienced those diverse forms of reception when you go into the archives. So I'm curious, particularly now, what that was like for you and how that played out, the varieties of ways people received you into the archives.
Sure. So for your first question, yes, I do. So a lot of how I get information about free people of color, it started with those registrations. It also starts with children's indenture papers. One of the things that I stumbled upon, wasn't expecting to find, as I was looking for slave patrol records, was a whole box full of indentured papers for free children in Southampton County. When I got to the indenture papers for a 6-month-old, I just stopped reading and started photographing and decided to come back to it after the dissertation. But a lot of my work on children relied upon looking outside of just these rebellion court cases, because there are a few families who actually show up and indenture their children in the middle. Like there are trials for insurgents happening, and then in the middle of it they're reading indenture papers into the record, and then back to another trial, right? So they're all in the same courtroom at the same time, and it was such an exploitative system of labor, indenture for free children. My question was like, why are parents doing this? Why would they do this? And the best, what I argue in the book is that they know that expulsion from Virginia is a very real possibility, and having labor contracts with white people is one way to keep their children with them while they finish out their own labor contracts. And they're also indenturing their children to white men who do not have slaves. They only have free people of color on their land at the time. So thinking through the ways, right, that even these really exploitative forms, people are being very savvy and very creative about how they're navigating a really fraught place. Southampton County becomes the source of a whole bunch of free people of color who travel to Liberia. They go to West Africa. They emigrate right after the rebellion. And the population goes down slightly. Many people probably migrated to cities rather than stay in rural environments. So those shifts and changes, like they wouldn't necessarily be very visible unless you paid attention to things outside of the trials, and who else is showing up. As far as the reception in the archive goes, I think we all have stories about what happens when you show up in spaces unexpectedly. I will say, broadly speaking, in the county itself, I've had very good experiences with folks. In the archive, that's another thing, mostly because I think the question of how, for some folks at the libraries I visited, the question of how is not a place where they're kind of ready to go. So I'll just kind of request the big things that I need, and I'll work on the how on my own. This assumption that like our history can't be found, or that I'm just never going to find anything on that. It takes a lot of creativity and imagination when looking at catalogs, to decide to, well, you know what, I actually am going to pull this whole box and see what might be floating around in there. I never expected to find receipts for slave patrols. I thought that stuff would have been tossed, and I was able to map out what a typical slave patrol before the rebellion would have looked like. So, I think we all, as scholars, and people of color who are scholars, have ways of navigating, not with keeping our integrity intact. So I may not be exactly forthcoming about exactly what my focus is, but I just really want to look at these family papers, or I'm just interested in women broadly, or I'm just interested in. I actually had the opportunity to go on a Nat Turner bus tour, which is a whole other book that I could write about what exactly a Nat Turner bus tour is. But there are ways that some of the methodology I had to work with is akin to what social scientists had to do. I had to sit and have conversations with folks about things that had nothing to do with the rebellion, to then get access to the original minute books because somebody's cousin was cousins to the person who had access to them. Or I went with a good friend of mine to the Pork, Peanut, and Pine Festival. I believe she was Little Miss Peanut 1985, and sat out and talked to folks. And through that historic society, got in touch with another historical society that got me on a Nat Turner bus tour from out of state. There's this other kind of work you have to do, because this is very personal. I mean, I don't have to go on living in Southampton County, but many of the folks who I've spoken to over the years, they do. So I think,
Yeah, much of what you're saying.
Catch me offline and we can talk. We can swap stories about which archives and which archivists.
Much of what you're saying I've experienced. You don't have to answer it now. I'll ask you later, but it was really along the lines of the way conversation is going in the public arena now about history and what's being taught and how it's being discussed. And so I wondered if any of that impacted your research now, because what you're saying is true. All of us have gone through what you're talking about, but I was curious about what it was like today with everything that's out in the public arena.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so I was talking to somebody last night about pop culture, and Harry Beecher Stowe is famous for writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, and all the characters in that book, they get a treatment in a stage play that travels the country. They become American archetypes. People, white performers make their careers portraying these characters well into the 20th century, right? It has all this cultural capital. Harry Peter Stowe also wrote another book called Dread of the Great Dismal Swamp, loosely based on Nat Turner. In fact, one of the images that will come up in a Google search is actually an illustration from her book of Nat Turner. Dread didn't take off. Those characters didn't take off in the same way. You know, there were no stage plays for Dread of the Great Dismal Swamp. They didn't have that cachet in mainstream, right? But it did for Black people, not Stowe's work, but Black people, right, built a whole folklore around Nat Turner. They had sayings about Nat Turner. He was still alive in those ways. So when I think about the contemporary moment, right, I sometimes wonder, right, what flies under people's radar and what is on people's radar, right? And I don't know that, at least in this moment, that I've experienced even the same level of attention as I experienced when Nate Parker's movie came out. That like that type of popular media required a different kind of attention and response in different ways. I think because the book is about women, that they'll be a very different. I think if it was a book just about Nat Turner, I think it would be, the reception would be really different publicly, and whose radar it was on would be really different publicly. I do expect to run into the age-old question. I often get the question, why? Why did they do it? As if there's any other answer, but that slavery was awful. So I expect to continue to get like those kinds of questions, right? Or isn't this so horrible? And I'm just kind of, yeah, of course it was horrible. Violent systems require violent, rebellious responses. Yeah, but yeah, we can chat offline about swap archival stories about being in the trenches with this work.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Mary. And you have Jessica Millward. Let me just try to spotlight her. I'm not able to, but go ahead, please, Jessica.
Hi, Vanessa. Good to see you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
so you're out here luxuriating.
Yes, this is. I'm broadcasting.
Okay, historians on Housewives luxuriating.
I'm broadcasting. I am luxuriating. It's hot. We are dying out here. So I am broadcasting from a swimming pool. I'm consistent with my brand. Listen, I want to follow up on the excellent question. Well, first of all, let me back up. Congratulations. You know, I've been a big fan of yours for quite some time, and this is a beautiful book. So that's the first thing. The next thing is following up on the question beforehand. I just wonder, in terms of personal safety, if you were ever, number one, nervous about doing this kind of work, and are you nervous now, given the big hubbub and I wouldn't say new violence in the country, I would say the loud violence in the country right now against this type of work?
I think, you know, I'm 100% aware. And for much longer, well before my book came out, you know, I know of others of us in this history game who have dealt with, you know, outright threats, who have dealt with all kinds of, you know, out-of-pocket interactions. So I do know that there's that possibility, that there's a possibility, and at the same time, you know, it is a book about people who faced far greater threats than I do. And so I think that one of the ways that I deal with that reality is always speaking the contemporary county in the conversation. And always speaking the contemporary moment into the conversation. Because of course this is present, right? Like, of course, this is as present as it is past. They just changed that street sign. They
Right.
just changed it in February, just in time for me to amend that part of the book, that it has changed. I also think, you are offering, I now have this opportunity to just talk about various care practices. I think
Mm-hmm.
Jessica Johnson, one of the things that is also an answer to her question, and it's an answer to your question, is that, like, I'm not alone in this game. I have a whole network.
Mm-hmm.
I have a whole network, thank God, of amazing women and scholars to lean on, and to hop in the group chat with, whether it's some wildness in the profession, because it gets wild, or it's some wildness in the streets, or it's people launching themselves into upper sky, while there's like wildfires or whatever. Whatever it is, right? This work can be isolating, and fighting to do it in community has saved my life on more than one occasion.
Excellent.
And
Sorry, go
so
ahead.
that's the other thing, is that it's not just, am I at risk of just disappear? It's like, but I got folks who would notice.
Right.
It's this thing,
Right.
right? Who would notice, and who would come look? Who would come look? Who would, they would be on the Netflix special, Finding Dr. Holden, to come
No,
find
I'm
me.
serious. I'm
And they have
serious
had to
because
come find me sometimes, to be completely honest.
wow.
Come find me sometimes and be like, okay, where are you? Because this work, there is an emotional affect in these sources. Like I shared, I got to a 6-month-old being indentured until they turned 21, and I was like, I actually just have to put this down. I can't do this right today. I will write this because clearly, someone out there has given me these sources. I need to write this, but I'm not gonna have it today. There are, I think sometimes people hear self-care and they're like, oh, she must, light some candles and do a little yoga. And like maybe sometimes I do that, but self-care is also about community care. And if there's anything
That's
that the women
beautiful.
I'm looking at have taught me, it's that you need a network and you need community.
That's so Deborah Gray White. That goes back to the essence, right? That's so Deborah Gray White. Let's live in community.
Um, And, I mean, I think, and there are like different layers to that community. It took me far
Mhm.
too long to learn about peer mentoring. Shout out to JMJ. It took me far too long to think about having a constellation of mentors. It took me far too long to ask people for help, because I was one of the problems with the legacy I mentioned is that I was not raised to ask for help. Right. So I think that and then also talking about it, like I am right now, and just being like, look, like there are ways that we are also learning and continuing to survive. I say in the book, survivor is a word we use for people who have endured, but it's also the word in English for people who are bereaved. And
Okay.
so there is collective grief that I'm trying to write about in this particular community. Grief that is very much held when people call it the rebellion. There is grief in that state.
Mhm.
And then the same goes in the present, right? There are ways, I mean, who among us this year is not grieving, whether we're
Right.
recognizing it or not, right? So that the survival, it is as much about processing this grief together, right, as enduring together, right? And of course, I can't get away without talking about defiant celebration, with Jessica Johnson on the chat. So, right, like that taking these defiant moments of celebration and jubilation, and also kind of like the defiant curation. Like I really love
Hmm.
this whole family was
I
just
love that.
preserving a cave in a swamp for like centuries, and decided to maybe mention it in 2014. But they've been on their own. It did
Mhm.
not matter that Virginia, of all places, right, with all the things, You study Maryland. You studied the
Yeah,
Chesapeake.
but I studied the Chesapeake. The reason I asked the danger question is I know that I faced some hostility just going to look at records in the Hall of Records in Maryland, though I love Maryland State Archives. So I couldn't even imagine going and doing an actual rebellion that scared people to their complete core. So that's really, I've been very impressed in the way in which you've cultivated different relationships. I think that often we as historians forget that sometimes we have to deal with living people and the memory keepers. So I can talk to you at length, and we will talk at length.
So I'll
love
tell
it.
the story. And this is also for you, Mary Elliott. So I did some work at the Virginia Historical Society. It's now the Virginia Museum of History and Culture,
Oh, I know it well.
and it's housed in the old Confederate Memorial Building right next to the
Mhm.
Daughters of the Confederacy, like headquarters, right? And often when I was there on a Mellon grant, I was the only black person black person. I think there was an archivist, though she works in the 20th century, so we didn't work much together. But the only black person who was not on the custodial staff or working in a service capacity in the building. And I will say, the staff were incredibly lovely to me and would actually check in on me throughout the day to see if I was doing okay. And one day, a gentleman who worked downstairs asked me, what are you doing up there all day? Like, why are you why are you in that reading room? What are you doing up there all day? And I said, oh, I'm here to look at the Southampton Rebellion. And he thought that was hilarious. And he looked at me and he said, well, don't tell them that. And he walked away. And the truth is, the archivists that were there had they'd granted me this grant, and of course, they knew what I was looking at. But the "well, don't tell them that" has stuck with me as I've done this research. And how many other scenarios in which Black people of a particular age have said, "Well, don't tell them that." This age-old wisdom. And I will say, there have been situations, sometimes in Southampton, sometimes in libraries, where "well, don't tell them that" has served me well. And that's, when in the future, when I'm, emeritus, I'll write the tell-all of my adventures. But until then, I'll continue to keep silent about the ins and outs of all that.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. It's lovely to see you.
It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to see you all, really.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Vanessa. We are almost at, I would have a question, but this could perhaps lead us to several more minutes. And as it's almost 6:30, and I can ask this question to Vanessa later, then perhaps let's see if any others have questions. Let's give the chance to those who are attending the session. If you have any additional questions or comments for Vanessa. Nope. Okay, then what I do is to thank Vanessa for this wonderful book. Then I just started the book. I was not able to read the entire thing yet, but I'm really excited about the book, and also the possibilities that we have here in making connections with other slave rebellions elsewhere. This was going to be my question. But in any case, what I want to do now then is just to conclude the session, reminding you that today we are discussing Surviving Southampton by Vanessa Holden, and this is a book that was just published by University of Illinois Press. And I encourage you to buy the book. It's a book that is, people are saying that, and from what I read up to here, that the book is very pleasant to read, despite the fact that this is a heavy topic. And this is also a good chance for you to consider adopting the book in your courses this coming fall. I believe that is a book that undergraduate students and graduate students will love. I think that all the discussion also regarding methodology and how to deal with the archive is important, African-American women as well. And the way the book is written, I think that is also interesting, an interesting example and model for those of you who are writing a dissertation, who are writing a first book, or who are writing an essay and want to know how to write history. Now I want to invite you, because we have several other sessions of the Slaveryarchive Book Club. We are going to continue then. I think that we have about 12 sessions until the end of the year. And our next book is going to be, then we are going to have the session on August 4th. This is 5 p.m., a Wednesday as well. And this is the book Claiming Widowhood by Brandy Bremer. And this is a book published by Duke University Press. Then it was published, I believe it is last year or just this year. Then get the book, go to slaveryarchivewordpress.com, register there, and you are going to be here on Zoom and also on YouTube. Then I see you probably then on August the 4th. Take also a look at the whole program of the Slaveryarchive Book Club to include perhaps in the teaching that you'll be doing next fall as well. Otherwise, again, big congratulations to Vanessa. I want to spotlight her, but I cannot do that. Let me just see if I can. Here she is. Then thank you so much, Vanessa. It was a wonderful session, not only because of the book, but also because of your presentation and the discussion we had. And it was a big pleasure to be with you this entire year, sharing this Slaveryarchive Book Club fun. And I am sure that our co-hosts, Jessica and Alex, who are here with us, let me just show Alex. He's there. Jessica, she's always here. And it's nice to be able to celebrate your book today. Thank you so much. Thank you all who came, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you for coming.
Congratulations!
Get the book, assign the book. She's short, she cute. Get the book.
Great, yeah. Get it now. See you soon, folks.